Hello Brian, thanks for joining us.
Dan, great to be here.
Well, of course, we met this time a year ago, and obviously a lot has gone on since then. We've seen everything from the proposals for MiFID II, the first draft come out, a lot more developed in EMEA. How's things changed for you?
I think, it's a big concern for us, right? Making sure that MiFID II gets implemented appropriately. I mean, there's things that certainly need to go into place. The biggest concern we have is around the category of OTF, right? The organized trading facilities. Clearly, we want to see that as part of MiFID II. For us, the big drivers behind that is about choice and transparency. The buy side that we talk to, it's an important part of what they look for in terms of best execution, in terms of finding liquidity. So when we look at it and removing that as a potential fourth category, it's a problem because it's the type of crossing that most of the brokers provide, including Morgan Stanley. It's not a systematic internalizer. It's not an MTF where we lose kind of client discretion, so we do think it's an important part of the best ex process.
So, as you said, it's something that's been a proposal then. How likely is it that this one's going to come to fruition?
I think it's very likely, or it's very real, I should say, and I think we're encouraging people right now. We're still in, the proposal still, as of today, in Marcus Ferber's hands. It will be presented to the European Commission, but clearly we want to educate people on why we think it's important. That includes both the regulators, the buy side, and it really is more about the buy side, because I think encouraging them to talk about, ultimately, the regulator and the politicians will look at it and say, well, we need to protect the retail investor. But at the end of the day, when you think about mutual funds and pension funds, they represent the interests of the retail investor equally.
Well, this is it, and it seems to be one of the big talking points of the day, which is that the regulators seem to be saying, we want to hear from you, we want to hear from you. But there's equally people on the actual industry side saying, well, we want to tell you how things are changing, but you're not listening to us. Why do you think there is such a strong disconnect?
I think there's a disconnect. There's different influences out there. I think the exchanges certainly have a view on this. I think the brokers certainly have a view. What we're trying to say is objectively go to who actually represents the underlying investors, and that's the buy-side community, and ask them to actively engage on this topic, which many of them have, whether it's through the IMA or through a FAMA, but I think it's a continual process. I mean, I think that's continuing to go in and go to Brussels and talk to local politicians, local regulators. I think here in the UK, by and large, the FSA certainly does understand the impact, but trying to equally educate some of the continental regulators and politicians is important.
Now, you were just saying to me you're itching to get to the next panel session, which should be kicking off in the next few minutes, talking about changing your business, working in the post-trade environment. Yeah. What are the key points that you're looking to see addressed and that you're looking to hear about?
Well, I think the post-trade side is important, but from the post-trade side, there's been this issue around OTC, and that OTC is bad. And, people will point back to the G20 and that everything should be traded on an exchange. We don't necessarily feel that's the case. What we do feel is that here in Europe, the OTC, the 40% should be cleaned up. In our opinion, it's realistically like around 18% when you factor out non-price forming transactions that occur in the marketplace. So the issue for us is about more rules around better flagging of data, better flagging of trades to get to the end goal, which I think everyone wants, is a consolidated table.
So well, exactly, this is it. In a lot of ways, I think that is the solution that seems to be not so much overlooked, but it's getting marginalized to some degree. That they're talking about this idea, we want a consolidated tape. Now they're talking about privatizing it, so it won't be a fully consolidated tape that the industry has been calling out for. And then they're all, as you said, they're talking about that essentially the OTC is the new demon that was high-frequency trading. Now that you've demonized high-frequency trading, HFTs come out and say, well, clearly not. They've looked at it and gone, okay, fine, you're right, it isn't. Now they're looking at OTC going, but now you're doing all these dodgy over-the-counter, under-the-counter deals, if you follow me.
Yeah, and OTC in and of itself, I mean, the concern we have is around, even OTC is traditional voice broking. If I can find the other side of a trade, if I can match two buyers on a traditional cash desk, that transaction is fine, but voice broking has now been brought into the fray as potentially problematic, and that changes the dynamic of a broker. At the end of the day, a broker is there to match a buyer off with a seller. That's the definition of a broker. So the fact that whether it's done traditional methods or whether it's done electronically, and clearly technology is aiding in that process in terms of making it more efficient, to me that's not necessarily a problem.
Well, finally, as we are going to have to wind it up to make sure you don't miss out on that session, where do you see markets going over the next year or so? What picture would you like to see, and how likely do you think it is that that's going to happen?
Well, I think the bigger issue that we have in the marketplace, both more generically, is volumes. I think we've seen from a European perspective, there's a lot of macro uncertainty, which has impacted a lot of institutional investors where either structurally they're underweight Europe, and that, you look at the broker-dealer community and you look at what is TradeTech today, it could be smaller this time next year. I mean, I think that the volumes in the marketplace, it's an industry on itself, and it's driven by transactions, and that we're seeing volumes that are 20, 30% lower than where they were 4 or 5 years ago, but the industry hasn't gotten smaller. So that is a concern, and it's certainly something that's been felt for the better part of 9 months, and I think that's a continuing trend.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having
us. Pleasure as always. Enjoy the rest of the show, and we'll speak very soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.